Hello, welcome to the France 24 interview. Sleazy males in power taking women for granted, or as a New York Times opinion piece put it, droit du dirty old men, the license of dirty old men. It's been open season on France's macho culture and predatory French men since last month's arrest of former IMF chief Dominique Strauss-Kahn amid charges he sexually assaulted a hotel housekeeper in New York. Now, of course, Strauss-Kahn is accused of a violent crime. By contrast, much of the current debate is about more nuanced behavior, from aggressive flirting to suggestive language. But is lurid behavior something deeply ingrained in the French male DNA? And will the so-called DSK affair change the way men act towards women and vice versa? These are all questions for my guest today, Cécile Elduy. Welcome to the show. You are Associate Professor of French Literature at Stanford University, a specialist on the cultural history of the body, and specifically, let me get this right, the history of sexuality from the Renaissance to the present day.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. And this is why we have you here, because we think that you will have a sort of interesting perspective on the current DSK case. But I want to begin with your reaction to the reaction here in France, especially among the political elite, a lot of the intellectual elite, when this case first broke. You recently wrote a column in Le Monde about this, the newspaper. You seem to have been a little outraged, to say the least.
To say the least. So I followed the whole affair online, on blogs and newspapers, editions, and what was more striking to me was that the first 3 days after the announcement of the arrest of Dominique Strauss-Kahn, the focus of most commentators and political figures in France, specifically on the left, were in a defense of Dominique Strauss-Kahn and making a case for suspending judgment until more is known, and putting forward the notion of presumed innocent until proven guilty.
Giving them the benefit of the doubt.
Exactly, but there was absolutely no mention of the fact that it was, as you said, a very serious crime that had been brought up with this arrest, and no mention of the presumed victim as well, to the point that actually some commentators or friends of Dominique Strauss-Kahn and intellectual figures dismissed her interpretation and her suit as a plot against a preeminent political figure who was also a hopeful, a presidential hopeful in the future election in 2012. So my reaction was, wait a minute, we're talking about something extremely serious on a legal basis, also in terms of what it says of gender roles, gender assumptions, and their relation to power structures. And there was no awareness in the first 3-4 days on the part of the political and intellectual elite of what was at stake intellectually, legally, politically, really.
But since then, it seems like there's been slight revision, right? They've taken a step back, say, wow, this is a big story. We might, a little more political correctness has crept in since then.
Yeah, well, they've been rightfully, I think, accused of being insensitive to the trials of the victim, and also to insensitive to the potential for a real case behind the indictment. So there were several accusations against this first response. One was it was misogynist in its gist, because it was dismissing rape as something not that important compared to the political career of a man such as Strauss-Kahn. Another one was anti-Americanism, because the first reactions were extremely violent against the perp walk.
And the judicial system itself.
Well, the judicial system itself, and the way that he was treated like anyone else who would be arrested in New York.
Cécile, the flip side of this, you are French, but you've been teaching in the US, you've been there for 8 years. What was the American reaction? I mean, it was a stark contrast, wasn't it, with what you were hearing in France?
It was night and day. In the US, the reaction was of outrage at all those hypotheses of conspiracy theory that would explain this arrest, and a very strong sense that the political elite in France and the French feminists were out of touch with a case that was, for the American audience, a clear-cut case of sexual abuse, potential sexual abuse, a sexual crime. So the American response was looking back at French culture and saying, what's wrong here? And are we being a little deluded with our love of French culture in general? And we've not seen that gender roles are extremely archaic still in France, and a lot of things are left unconscious and unspoken, really. There's a lot of taboos.
One American columnist, Katha Pollitt, she wrote a column in a left-leaning publication, The Nation, in which she essentially said, "Dear France, my love affair with you is over."
Yeah.
Don't you think this is a little bit, regardless of where you stand on this case, a little bit high and moralistically high and mighty of the Americans to get up here and point a finger at the French? Are the Americans really that much better on this front?
I think that they are better on the sexual harassment in the workplace front. They are better at implementing anti-discrimination laws in the workplace. They're not necessarily better in the kind of mindset that dictates who gets hired, who doesn't get hired because she is pregnant, for instance, and that there's still a lot of misogyny in both societies. And women's rights have progressed on different levels in both countries. So for instance, in France, if you're a working woman, you don't think twice about having children if you want them, because you will have maternity leave for 3 months at least.
3 months of maternity leave, yeah.
If you have more than 3 kids, it goes up to 6 months. You will also...
And in the U.S., it's what, 2 weeks still?
I think that the legal national thing is 2 weeks, but some said it a little longer. The thing is, a lot of women don't get hired because of the risk that they might get pregnant, and that would be an obstacle to the productivity of the company.
But there are some fronts where it seems that the French have made a lot of progress with regard to female rights. Let me just ask you one front where they haven't. You're at Stanford, and you mentioned that they have sexual harassment awareness courses, mandatory for all the students.
Actually, for the faculty, for the staff, for anyone who's in a position of mentoring, supervising, or hiring others. So anyone who is a hierarchical superior, if you wish, and has to mentor, who is in a position to have power.
Authority.
Yes, over others. It's not just a seminar, or it's actually a real training. It's 2-hour courses that you take. You have to pass the course.
Does that exist anywhere in France? I mean, okay, France 24.
France 24,
I took a long psychological exam when I got hired here. I never took a sexual harassment course. I don't think there's any company in France that makes you do that.
It's not required by the law. It's required in California. It's a mandated. It's every other year. It's mandated. So it's in the law. And in France, there's no such things. You have the law, and every citizen is supposed to know the law. But nothing is implemented to actually have citizens be aware of new laws and what they meant in practice. And I think what's really interesting in the sexual harassment training is how precise it is about, okay, here's the case, you have this person, the scenario. How do you choose to discriminate between this is sexual harassment, this is not? And being a woman, I would think I would be aware of what sexual harassment is, and I learned a lot doing it.
Let me ask you about the women. We are running out of time a little bit. The role of the women here, we've been talking a lot about the men. Is it, I'm a male saying this, I have to be very careful how I put this question, but could you say to a certain extent, sometimes the women are enablers in this culture, to the extent that, are there someone who almost leverage this culture? They know how to play the game.
I think that they will not put it that way. And if you're from the
American... In my male misogynistic way.
I don't think it's not actually a male versus female divide, but more an American or Anglo-Saxon versus French culture divide. The French feminists are against gender wars, and what they want is rights, written in the law. But they have been accommodating to the mentalities, the mindset, the gestures, the inappropriateness of some gestures, saying, things have to be flexible. We have, sexuality is a good thing in itself. We don't want to have this big moralizing tone that dominates human relationships. So there's a kind of faith in, human relationships will sort it out. In practice, it has been actually, I think, an obstacle to a lot of young or less young women to speak up and say, well, this is where I draw the line. This is where actually the law draws the line.
And it's a disincentive. My final question to you is, do you see a shift or hope of a younger generation coming of age here in France, post-DSK affair, new sexual mores? Are things changing? Do you think the way French males are going to act towards their female compatriots and vice versa, is that going to change?
I think so. I think there is a generational divide as well. At least from the reactions I got from the op-ed I wrote in Le Monde, male and women my age were like, thank you for writing this. Also, I think that the DSK generation, he's 62, this is the 68 generation, the sexual liberation for them was extremely important, so it was an identity thing. I think that we didn't have to fight for it. Sexuality is not such a big thing that we have to put forward as a right. And I think it changes relationships because we can have de-eroticized relationship and it's all right. So I think there's much more respect for persons as person in my generation as opposed to this game of seduction that I feel we've witnessed in the post-68 generation.
We're going to have to leave it on that hopeful note. I have spoken to some people who said this DSK affair, it's going to be a blip in the radar. Things will just go back to the way they've always been eventually, but you apparently wouldn't agree with that.
Well, this is my American side being optimistic.
I love ending on optimism. Cécile Laduy, you are a professor of French literature at Stanford, a specialist in the history of sexuality from the Renaissance to the present day. I thank you very much. You've been here today to discuss the DSK affair on the day that he is appearing at a hearing in New York to answer charges that he sexually assaulted a hotel housekeeper last month in New York. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks to all of you for watching the interview here on France 24.